The portrait that Basil Hallward had painted of him would be a guide to him through life, would be to him what holiness is to some, and conscience to others, and the fear of God to us all. There were opiates for remorse, drugs that could lull the moral sense to sleep, but here was a visible symbol of the degradation of sin. Here was an ever-present sign of the ruin men brought upon their souls. How can you conclude that he is some gay icon? And another one done. So this month we read The Picture of Dorian Grey by Oscar Wilde. I'm sure you're already familiar with Oscar Wilde as well as with the story The Picture of Dorian Grey, but here's a short summary. Dorian Gray is this beautiful, innocent man in the very beginning, and he's having his portrait painted by a man named Basil Hallward, and Basil Hallward idolizes him, finds him to be pure perfection, so innocent, so wonderful, and he puts him on a pedestal and idolizes Dorian Gray. Meanwhile, another friend comes in, Lord Henry, and he meets Dorian Gray and also finds him very handsome, very perfect, innocent. So Lord Henry shows Dorian Gray, the innocent Dorian Gray, a new way of living. Lord Henry represents the new way of thinking, the way the world is. He is a bon vivant, as you would say in French. He's just all about the pleasures of the world. And so Lord Henry gives him the picture that aging is horrible. If only we can stay young forever. And so at this point, Dorian's listening to him and he thinks, it kind of upsets him. He doesn't really like it, but it intrigues him. And so at that point, he makes a wish, a very serious wish, that if only all signs of aging would not manifest on his face, but rather manifest on his portrait. And so this serious wish is granted. Not only do the signs of aging manifest itself on the portrait, but also all of his sins. And he remains as he did the day he had his portrait done. I really liked this because it is an exploration of what it is to sin. I mean, can you imagine what it would be like if all your sins would appear on a portrait of you? How would you actually look like if all your sins were put on the portrait? And so it is a deep dive into what sin is, what it does to you, what it does to other people, how sin is not personal. It affects everybody, not only you, but everybody around you. Hey everyone, it's Alexis. Nice to see you again. If you are interested in joining me, you can. I put a link in the description with the Telegram group that you can join, where we share our thoughts, favorite passages, and then at the end of the month, we meet up to talk about the book. This month we are reading Logos Rising by Dr. E. Michael Jones. So if you would like to join us, please do. Like I said, the link is in the description below. And for now, let's get back to the book review. I find it quite curious how many people out there consider this to be a quote-unquote LGBT kind of book, how he's like how Dorian Gray is a gay icon, where in the end, spoiler alert, Basil Hallward, who does have this affection towards Dorian, ends up dead, ends up being murdered by Dorian Gray himself. And not just with Dorian Gray, I think in general, when it comes to Oscar Wilde has kind of been hijacked. He is not the gay icon that people put out there to be. Everybody knows that Oscar Wilde made a deathbed conversion into the Catholic Church, but what most people don't know is that he was seeking the Catholic faith in the very beginning of his life, particularly his time in school, in university. He was so close to converting. Unfortunately, his father was very much against it. He would have been a heretic, and his father did not want that image of his son, nor for his family, and so Oscar Wilde did not go that route, unfortunately for him, for many, many years. And so he lived this kind of double life. He was married, but he also had a lover. And so he was a person who struggled greatly. He knew the truth, but he just did not live it. The first half of it is just introducing you to the situation, all the different people, the circumstances, how this portrait came to be, who Dorian Gray is, Lord Henry, and Basil Hallward are. Paints a picture, no pun intended, of the circumstances, the situation. And then halfway through is when we get to when the ball kind of starts rolling, the picture starts to manifest his sins. And it's so, I find it so brilliantly written because it's so subtle and you can see it. It starts with a little, I remember, I think it was a little smile, like a little smirk, but it's not the kind of smile that is innocent or happy. There's like a touch of evil in that smile, and Dorian notices it. It's fascinating because the first thing he does is he hides it instead of leaving it in his I think it was in his study or something, in one of the rooms in his home that was out in the open for the public. He puts it up in the attic and hides it so that no one can see, and he's the only one who notices it, who notices the change. So in the beginning, Dorian is this very innocent person, and then we see how sin creeps into his life, how it slowly destroys who he is and all the relationships around him. It's almost a bit like a psychology book because it really dives deep into the psychology of human beings as well. Like I said, there's a character named Lord Henry. Lord Henry kind of reminds me of Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens was very witty, very his rhetoric was wonderful. So when I was an atheist, like I loved Christopher Hitchens. There was just this way about him and the way he spoke. It was very charismatic and just witty. And so Lord Henry is like that. Basil Hallward is the one who is so obsessed with Dorian. He's just, infatuated with Dorian. He finds him to be perfection, and it's this unhealthy fascination with Dorian. I know from reading about the book that they said that Oscar Wilde actually had to tone down the homosexuality, but like I said, I don't understand how this could be a triumphant LGBT kind of book, where in the end, clearly we know what Oscar Wilde thought of homosexuality. Whilst I was reading this, I kept thinking to myself, I can only conclude that Oscar Wilde, was a Catholic. Despite living the life that he lived, he was a Catholic. And I don't know how you could read this and not think that he was Catholic, because it's all over the book. Not only does it talk about morality, Catholic morality, it talks about confession, it talks about beauty, it talks about Catholicism itself. At one point, he expresses that Dorian was going to convert to the church. So a bit of Oscar Wilde's life is in here. And so I don't know how anybody could read this and think that it's an LGBTQ plus ABC kind of book. Lord Henry is funny and, like I said, of the world. But the way Oscar Wilde wrote about him, you can only conclude that he does not approve of Lord Henry and Lord Henry's way of thinking or life. Oscar Wilde knew the influences that someone can have on someone's mind, that ideas can have on one's mind. At one point, Lord Henry offers Dorian a book, and Dorian reads it. He's fascinated. He finds it all horrible and it upsets him, but it's so intriguing. But the book did what it needed. It poisoned his mind, as he says in the story, that the book poisoned Dorian's mind. And this is actually from Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde had the same experience. This is actually from his life. He read a book called À rebours, Against Nature by Huysmans, and it did the same. It influenced Oscar Wilde a lot and led him to doing whatever he did with his life. I know it's two different books, but I remember reading Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. And sometimes I thought that the discussion just went on a little too long, whereas this was like the perfect length. I know it's different, but I really like the philosophical discussions that the characters had. And I just really love how Oscar Wilde writes. It's beautifully written. And there are a lot of descriptions of things and people and the way I think ornate things. So I wanted to share just a couple of quotes. What the worm was to the corpse, his sins would be to the painted image on the canvas. They would mar its beauty and eat away its grace. They would defile it and make it shameful. And yet the thing would still live on. It would always be alive. On his return, he would sit in front of the picture, sometimes loathing it and himself, but filled at other times with that pride of individualism that is half the fascination of sin, and smiling with a secret pleasure at the mishapen shadow that had to bear the burden that would have been his own. Like, come on. Some of those quotes like that just making me think of myself. I think of this as like, I find it so interesting how I remember I was very interested in like murderers, the life of murderers, and how people can be so awful. It's just this, it's an unhealthy fascination about the sin and the grotesque and all that is awful. Anyway, those are some of my thoughts for The Picture of Dorian Gray. I would love to know what you thought about it if you've read the book. Short but very intense study of the human condition, what it means to sin, what sin is, what we are made for, why sin will eventually lead to our ruin. It reminded me a lot of Faustus by Goethe, who also makes the same kind of wish to the devil, and as well as The Telltale Heart, the short story by Edgar Allan Poe, of this conscience just, eating away at his mind and his soul. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I shall see you in the next one.